Hi, and welcome back to Clark's Chair, where we talk about how people's lives and jobs have been affected through COVID. Today, I'll be talking to a police officer who works in the United Kingdom, and we'll be talking about how his job has been affected and how crime has changed when the UK went into lockdowns and came out of lockdowns, and which crime had increased, decreased, and stayed the same. So, how have you been recently? You alright?
If I complained, nobody would care, so there's no point.
I guess you could say that. Um, so how's work then? How's it been recently?
So work's getting busier. There's a lot more going on. In the first lockdown, crime tumbled because there were no longer the victims out there, so the people weren't on the streets, so there was nobody really to go out and steal from. Most people were in their homes, so burglars couldn't commit burglaries, and your normal shop crime people who were going out there stealing stuff in shops couldn't do that either because the shops were all closed. So kind of crime fell massively in that way, other than domestics and neighbour disputes. So we were getting lots of calls to people who were having fights at home, and lots of people, neighbours, who were having arguments with each other just because they were in constantly and having contact with each other.
Right. So then, like you said about theft and stuff, would you say other crimes like dealing and like violent crime and stuff, would you say that's also decreased as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was no longer the opportunity. So I mean,
Right.
dealers eventually started to find other ways. Drug dealers, so they found other ways. They were doing deliveries to houses and stuff like that. But it was a lot easier for us to pick them up, the
Right.
people who were doing deliveries, because no one else was on the streets. So we were getting lots of arrests for people, but it still carried on because this is their way of making money. This is
Yeah.
their bread and butter. So they've got no other way of making money. So they never registered. They weren't entitled to any grants or any benefits from the government. So they had to keep finding ways to make their money.
Oh wow. So then would you say that with the dealing then, would you say that they tried to find their way around it, but because of the lockdown, would you say that at times like there was just more police on the roads than people were because everyone was in, so you could kind of get like pick them up quickly on what they were doing?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. It was easy to find people that, especially the first, because we had 3 lockdowns here.
Yeah.
So the first lockdown was really, really strict, and people adhered to it. And most people were, stayed at home, only did what they were allowed to do within the lockdown
Yeah.
rules. And obviously, as the subsequent 2 lockdowns came afterwards, then they were slightly less restrictive, and people were taking, were going out there and doing a bit more of their own thing rather
Mm.
than being as strict and hard as they were in the first one.
Right. So then after a lockdown, right? Because when the UK came out of lockdown, they did
Yeah.
free up quite a few things. So during that time, would you say that crime would have ramped up then?
So crime did pick up. It didn't pick up anywhere near to the levels prior to the very first lockdown,
Right.
but it definitely picked up. And obviously, so the gangs have definitely picked up. So there's been a lot more gang activity, a lot more stabbings, a lot more murders than we would normally have had. So actually, gang activity went up exponentially,
Oh,
whereas
wow.
other crimes didn't necessarily go up, because what was happening was is that the gangs were now looking to vie for their positions to sell their drugs,
Yeah.
to take up their territory, and they were looking to get first dibs on that territory before anyone else had the opportunity to get in there. And then other gangs were coming in to try and move them off, and so there was a territorial war going on between the gangs, and it was quite significant. We had quite a lot of stabbings, and quite a lot of murders as well.
Oh, right. So then after all that, second lockdown came, and then was it kind of a constant thing throughout when lockdowns came in and out? Like the gangs would ramp up their crime and stuff.
So So the gangs kind of, with the second two lockdowns, they didn't really adhere to it. So we were getting people, but a lot less. They were a lot less restrictive because a lot of businesses were able to continue, and what were considered to be essential works and essential businesses, that the scope was widened by the government, so it wasn't as strict as it was in the first one. So there was a lot more people on the streets anyway. So we did find a rise in robbery, because robbery was non-existent in the first lockdown, but we got a rise in robbery offences in the second one, personal robbery, and also cash in transit, because cash in transit became a big thing. So like where the cash wagons are delivering cash to the ATMs, and filling the ATMs, they were getting robbed more. So there was more of that as well.
Right. So then because of the policing and stuff, and because of COVID, has there been any protocols and rule changes and stuff that the police have had to kind of change their policing to?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the government brought in legislation that had never been, that was incredibly restrictive on what people could do and the activities they could carry out. And, the police had never been, in the UK anyway, had never had been put in this sort of position before, because, we kind of like to police by consent. So we like to police with the consent. Well, we've got, per head of the population, we've actually got one of the smallest police forces in the world, and the French have 3 times as many police as us, and the Germans 4 times as many per head of the population. So our policing is done by the consent of the people, because without that consent, there's no way we could get the activity done that we need to do. So we have to be a much more engaged with people, and that was always a big thing. And actually the legislation and the restrictions that the government put in place, especially, the first lockdown was all right, but the second 2 lockdowns, and the second lockdown and then the third lockdown, which was almost not even a lockdown, but the government still wanted us to go out there and fine people and restrict people's activities. It put a real strain on police and public relations.
So, because then you have such a smaller police force than, like you said, France and Germany, does that mean that you guys have to police, like you said, police by consent? Other than that, do you guys have to be smarter when you police, because you have less people? So do you have to be more organized and put your people where they should be and where they shouldn't be?
It's absolutely intelligence-led. So we do intelligence-led policing. So, we look at trends, crime trends. We look at where we're likely to get rises of crime, and then what we do is we will put in activity. So we have, effectively, for normal types of crime I'm talking about here. So we would put in policing, high visibility policing in one area, and then try and push that crime into another area where we might have covert police officers in place looking to get people in the act. So we kind of funnel people into areas so that we can pick them up as they commit those crimes.
Oh, okay. So then before COVID, and stuff like that, job, what would you say the most apparent kind of crime was? Other crime with would you say gangs and stuff like that, before COVID, have been quite violent and
Well, they had been, but the fact that they hadn't got all that money, they'd lost out on all that money during the lockdown. The first lockdown meant that they needed to find ways of making large money, and they needed to encroach onto other people's territory. So that's why there was a big rise in gang activity, and actually a big rise in gang recruitment, because what the other knock-on effect of lockdown is that, and this was across the board really, is that people were recruited into gangs more through drill videos on YouTube and stuff like that. So people actually became affiliated to gangs, but also on the other side of that, we had a lot of people being radicalised. So whereas before we had our traditional kind of terrorist organisations that would be like in the UK, for instance, would be your Muslim fundamentalists, your right-wing fundamentalists, and then your Northern Ireland terrorist organisations, like the IRA affiliated groups and
Right.
the Protestant affiliated groups. Well, that actually expanded massively. So we ended up getting groups that we always had groups, but they were never as radicalised. So our animal welfare lot. So we've got people who are out there for the welfare of animals. They've become really quite radicalised, and we've seen some activity from them. We've even had people and then obviously people have become active around Brexit. Our right wing terrorists have gone up massively. We've had a lot of right wing activity, and actually our preventative terrorist arrests have actually increased massively in the last 3 months, from people that have been online and self-radicalising and looking to carry out activities to kill, maim people or commit criminal damage through explosive devices or fires or other stuff like that.
All right. So after all that, then, you're just telling me about them ramping it up and stuff. How do you stop that? Like, what kind of things do you guys do to just kind of stop those things?
So obviously we work with our internet providers, so we work in that way to get them to take down the videos that might do that, to identify the sites, and then obviously there is the kind of the black ops stuff where we will put activity onto some of their websites that allows us to trace people that are going onto those websites.
Oh wow.
We'll also be able to identify people that are doing that are going to do stuff by using search patterns, and a lot of that is done. We use search words and stuff like that where people, if you put in something into Google and search it, then those words will highlight towards us. And also it works in relation to telecommunications as well, so not just the internet, but also on people's telephones and the messages that they send on their telephones. So we're able to, we're not just talking about one word. We're talking about someone using a lot of keywords that would or key searches that would identify them to us. And then not everyone, not all of those people then become terrorists. There's a lot more to it than that. But if we look at how those trends with those people are doing, and whether they step up and whether they increase and stuff like that. So there's a lot of activity that way. Then we also have a prevent strategy. So what we'll do is we will refer them to panels. So where we've identified these people, we'll get them to go to specialist panels that are made up of local authorities, psychiatrists, and therapists, and we will then look to find out why they're behaving in that way, and look to kind of influence them to behave in a different way, and try and kind of reset the norm. As a country, we're generally a centrist country, so we're not really an extreme country. But what the lockdown has done is made a lot more people extreme, but for lots of different reasons. So and it's not that everyone is extreme in the same way. And kind of Brexit kind of did that as well. So effectively, what happened is that so to most people, Brexit meant something totally different to what it meant to the next person.
Yeah.
And you probably couldn't get a consensus from people of exactly what everybody thought Brexit meant. And that's exactly the same as the way that the radicalisation has gone in relation to people during lockdown, the way they've radicalised themselves, because everyone wants something different and thinks that everyone should adhere to what they want.
Right.
I'm not talking. When I say everyone, I don't mean the whole population. I mean everyone who's become radicalised.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, that's an awkward one on how you change their mindset, because you can't. It's really hard to change the mindset of something like that.
Yeah.
And then one of the other things that has really become quite massive is online paedophilia. That's another one that's become a really big growth industry for us. But most of the stuff is actually generated in other countries. There is some stuff that's generated here, but in proportion to the amount of stuff that's out there, it's actually most of it is in other countries. But again, through our search the way that we search the internet and stuff like that, we've been able to identify people, and we've been able to get people and arrest people who are downloading those sorts of images or uploading those sorts of images.
So then with that stuff there, what countries would you say are the most apparent?
For producing,
for producing.
So I would say that some big countries for us are Asian countries. So Asian countries produce quite a lot.
Okay.
The Philippines is a fairly big producer.
Wow.
Russia is a big producer.
Oh.
The United States is a massive producer. There's lots of countries that do it. I mean, I'm not saying that the UK doesn't produce it. It absolutely does.
Yeah.
But not on the same levels as those. But then, we're talking different. We're talking especially with Russia and the United States, their population is much more bigger than ours. So you have to increase it by those numbers as well. But
yeah, for sure.
So effectively, they're probably the world's biggest producers of child pornography and paedophile related activity.
So then, with your job, right? What specifically do you do? Do you appoint people to kind of find those things, or is it something different?
Yeah, we generally have specialist roles. So around terrorism stuff, we have a large terrorism command, and actually, our terrorist activity for our known players, as it were, the people that are involved in terrorists, hasn't reduced even through any of the lockdowns really, and they still want to travel, and they're still finding ways to travel to go. Our hardcore terrorists I'm talking about. So they're still finding ways to go to their terrorist training camps, whether those camps are in the Arabian subcontinent, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Russia and Chechnya, places like that. So whether and I'm talking and the USA, in fact, because it's right wing as well as left wing. So we've got a lot of our right wing fundamentalists will go to America to train, and South America, and a lot of our Islamic fundamentalists will go to our hotspot countries like Syria and Iraq and places like that. So they'll still go to the places to do the training. They're still busy. They're still busy people. They're still looking to get their training. They're still looking to become further radicalised. So for those sorts of things, we have a specialist command. We've also got specialist officers who search the internet, and we actually the security services help with that as well. So we've got MI5, MI6, and GCHQ conduct activities around that sort of stuff. And then obviously with the child pornography, we've got an organisation called CEOPS, which effectively searches the internet for that sort of activity as well, and they get a lot of their data that comes through from the security services, where the security services will find stuff. They'll deem it as not being terrorist related, but then pass the activity over to CEOPS because of the fact that it is child pornography related or other sorts of things related. So we most of our stuff is specialist policing. Our general policing on the streets is we do have even within a city, we would have lots of specialists that just do our general policing. So most policing, most of our general people that answer 999 calls, the people that answer the emergency calls and stuff like that, they're jack of all trades, and they'll see everything, and they'll be the first ones on scene. But any further activity is carried out by our specialist departments.
Right. So then, just with the terrorism stuff, would you have they still been traveling? Like even oh really?
Yeah.
And then
they'll get boats. They'll use private planes.
Oh wow.
And some other than the first lockdown where the skies were clear, there were no planes really flying. But after that, I mean, there were still planes flying, and they were still finding ways to go to places. So they would still find their way to get into a country that wouldn't have a restriction on people travelling to it, and then fly on to their further destination to carry on their training.
Would you say that, would you say if the UK government if they would have shut the borders,
Yeah,
as you said in the first lockdown, but if they would have
yeah,
kept that,
yeah.
would the like I guess the terrorist organizations traveling would have they struggled a lot more with all that stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They would always struggle. Yeah, most definitely. But
And
they'll find ways to do it.
and
Because you have to remember that still our major so a lot of our freight was still going in and out, so our
yeah,
freight on freight shipping and stuff like that, so we still needed like
wow,
the ferries to bring in lorries of freight of food, of equipment,
yeah,
of clothing and all that sort of stuff, because that was still, you could still purchase that online.
mm,
So that was still moving, so there is always a way that if you've got enough money, you can always pay people to smuggle people.
uh, probably with the border shut and the canal closed up, that probably would have been a bit harder.
The channel.
Yeah, with the channel closing up, and if you didn't have
Yeah,
planes
yeah,
coming in, it
absolutely.
probably would have been harder. Hey?
Yeah, absolutely. But we're not self-sufficient.
No,
So we're a
true.
country that's not self-sufficient. So you
Yeah.
still need that freight and
Mm.
the borders to be open to a certain extent for people to come in and out. And then when our freight's coming in, because of the way it works, is that we don't actually. If we'd worked out a system possibly where the freight was brought to the shipping, put on the shipping, the drivers then disconnected from the lorries,
Yeah.
and then on the other end it was put onto new lorries for transportation within the UK with UK based drivers, then that might have reduced some. But
Right.
obviously, a lot of the drivers were they would go and they'll pick up their load in
Yeah.
wherever, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, wherever it may be, and then drive all the way to the Channel, get the ferry over,
Mm.
or use the tunnel, and then drive it to its end destination in the UK somewhere.
Ah,
So,
okay.
and those people, for a bit of extra money, they will, not all of them, but some of them will hide people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Paul.
No worries.
I'll just wrap that up there. I don't want to take too much of your time, but
Yeah, no worries, mate. All right,
yeah,
no problem.
really appreciate the call and coming on and doing this for me. Thank you.
No problem at all.